In this video, we will step into a world where routine jobs mask extraordinary violence, where the road ahead looks ordinary until it isn't. These crimes are not rare anomalies or distant legends. They are disturbingly common, unpredictable, and often hidden in plain sight. Imagine being alone for just a moment, trusting the wrong person, climbing into the wrong vehicle, or standing in the wrong place along a highway. The brutality you are about to hear is not abstract. It is intimate, sudden, and irreversible. Robert Bowers, State, Pennsylvania, age 50, death row. On a quiet Saturday morning in late October, worshippers gathered at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh expecting prayer, routine, and safety. What they encountered instead was the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in American history, a rupture so violent it redefined how hate-fueled extremism is understood in modern true crime. The man at the center of it, Robert Bowers, did not arrive as a shadowy outsider. He arrived armed, convinced, and broadcasting his hatred to the world. Bowers was born in 1972 and spent much of his adult life drifting through low-profile jobs, including long-haul truck driving. That work mattered. It fit a personality shaped by isolation and hours alone with grievance. Over time, his worldview hardened around anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that framed Jewish people as architects of immigration and social collapse. Online, he posted openly, repeatedly, and without irony. These were not cryptic warnings or jokes in poor taste. They were declarations. By the time he walked through the synagogue doors, the ideology was already fully formed. On October 27, 2018, during Shabbat services, Bowers entered the Tree of Life building carrying an AR-15 style rifle and handguns. Inside, he began shooting congregants as they prayed, shouting anti-Semitic slogans that made his motive unmistakable. The attack unfolded over roughly 20 minutes, long enough to claim 11 lives and wound 6 others, including responding police officers. This was not impulsive violence. It was targeted, ritualized, and fueled by an extremist belief system that framed murder as mission. Law enforcement engaged Bowers in a prolonged gunfight inside the synagogue complex. He was eventually shot, wounded, and taken into custody alive. The arrest marked the end of the attack, but the beginning of a much longer reckoning. Federal prosecutors charged him with multiple counts of hate crimes resulting in death, firearms violations, and obstruction of religious exercise. From the outset, the case carried national weight, not only because of the death toll, but because of what it represented, an unfiltered convergence of online radicalization and mass casualty violence. At trial in 2023, Bowers did not dispute the facts. He admitted to the killings and showed no remorse. His defense team offered limited mitigation, but the prosecution focused relentlessly on intent, premeditation, and hate. Jurors were presented with his own online posts, his words serving as a roadmap to the crime. The courtroom narrative was not about confusion or diminished capacity. It was about ideology weaponized into action. The sentencing phase underscored the stakes. Prosecutors argued that anything less than death would fail to account for the scale and symbolism of the attack. The jury agreed. In 2023, Bowers was sentenced to death for 11 counts of murder, a federal capital sentence reflecting both the brutality of the crime and its hate-driven motive. He remains on death row, awaiting execution. The case of Robert Bowers forces a question that lingers long after the verdict. When hate is broadcast in plain sight, when warnings are posted publicly and repeatedly, where does responsibility begin, and how many lives could be saved if those signals were treated as alarms rather than noise? Wayne Adam Ford, State, California, at age 45, death row. On an ordinary day in 1998, a man walked into a sheriff's office in Northern California, carrying a plastic bag. Inside was not evidence in the abstract, not a confession written on paper, but a severed body part taken from a murdered woman. That single act instantly transformed the room and announced the arrival of one of California's most disturbing serial killers. His name was Wayne Adam Ford, and the way he chose to surrender ensured that his crimes would never be described as accidental, impulsive, or misunderstood. Ford was born in 1961 and once wore the uniform of a U.S. Marine, a background that often complicates how the public tries to make sense of later violence. By the 1990s, however, that structure had collapsed. He worked as a long-haul truck driver, a job that offered anonymity, constant movement, and access to vulnerable people along highways and industrial corridors. His personal life was marked by domestic violence, substance abuse, and repeated contact with the criminal justice system. As his addiction deepened, so did his isolation, and the road became both his livelihood and his hunting ground. Between 1997 and 1998, Ford murdered at least 4 women across California. Many were sex workers, women living on the margins, whose disappearances rarely triggered immediate alarms. Ford would pick them up under the pretense of a ride or transaction, then subject them to sexual assault, strangulation, and prolonged physical abuse. After killing them, he dismembered their bodies and disposed of the remains along remote stretches of highway, using his familiarity with back roads and truck routes to avoid detection. The violence was not quick. Testimony later showed that several victims were tortured before death, a detail that haunted jurors and investigators alike. What ultimately stopped Ford was not a traffic stop or a tip from the public, but his own decision to walk into law enforcement. In November 1998, he arrived at the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office accompanied by his brother. The bag he carried was his introduction. Inside was part of a victim's body, offered as proof that he was telling the truth. Once in custody, Ford confessed in detail, calmly describing how many women he had killed and how he disposed of them. Detectives later confirmed his statements by locating remains in multiple counties, exactly where he said they would be. At trial, the prosecution painted Ford as a calculating predator who used mobility and victim vulnerability to his advantage. The defense attempted to argue diminished capacity, citing substance abuse and mental health issues. Jurors were unconvinced. The sheer consistency of his actions, the planning involved, and the deliberate nature of the crimes undermined any claim that he lacked control or understanding. After hearing graphic testimony and reviewing evidence from multiple crime scenes, the jury rejected mental health defenses outright. In 2006, Wayne Adam Ford was sentenced to death for 4 counts of first-degree murder. He was sent to California's death row, where he remains awaiting execution. His case leaves behind an uncomfortable question that still echoes through true crime history. How many victims can vanish along America's highways before the pattern is recognized? And how many killers depend on that silence to keep driving forward? Alfred Bourgeois, State, Texas, age 40, execution date December 11, 2020. The case of Alfred Bourgeois stands apart even among capital crimes because it did not unfold in darkness or secrecy, but in the confined, everyday space of a truck cab, where a child should have been safest. In 2002, Bourgeois did not target strangers or exploit anonymity along the highway. Instead, the violence was directed inward, toward his own 2-year-old daughter, transforming a routine work trip into one of the most disturbing child abuse cases to ever reach federal death row. Born in 1964, Bourgeois worked as a long-haul truck driver based in Louisiana, a job that kept him on the road for extended periods and often placed his family in close quarters for days at a time. Behind that mobile lifestyle was a documented history of domestic violence, control, and instability. By the time he set out on a work trip to Corpus Christi, Texas, Those patterns had already hardened. What followed was not a momentary lapse, but a sustained episode of cruelty that investigators later described as prolonged physical and sexual abuse inflicted over hours. During the drive, Bourgeois repeatedly beat his daughter inside the truck. Evidence presented at trial showed that he slammed her head against the windshield, bit her, and burned her, leaving injuries so severe that her small body could not recover. She ultimately died from internal trauma, consistent with extreme force. When questioned, Bourgeois attempted to distance himself from the responsibility by claiming the child was not biologically his, as if bloodlines could determine guilt or innocence. Medical testimony erased any ambiguity. The injuries were intentional, repetitive, and fatal. Authorities arrested Bourgeois at the scene shortly after the child's death. Because the crime occurred on federal property connected to a military base, the case was prosecuted in federal court, placing it under a legal framework where the death penalty remained an option. At trial, prosecutors focused on the methodical nature of the abuse and the absolute defenselessness of the victim. The defense argued that Bourgeois had a low IQ and limited intellectual capacity, suggesting diminished responsibility. Jurors rejected that claim, concluding that he understood his actions and their consequences. In 2004, Alfred Bourgeois was sentenced to death. Over the next 16 years, he filed multiple appeals, all unsuccessful, each revisiting the same arguments about intellectual disability and mitigation. Federal courts repeatedly upheld the conviction and sentence. In December 2020, the appeals ended. Bourgeois was executed by lethal injection at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. In his final hours, prison officials reported that Bourgeois requested a modest last meal, declining anything elaborate. His last words were brief. He expressed remorse and asked forgiveness, acknowledging the harm he had caused. There were no justifications, no defiance, no attempt to rewrite history at the end. Only a few sentences spoken after years of silence. The Bourgeois case leaves a lingering discomfort that no sentence can fully resolve. When violence happens within a family, behind closed doors, or inside a moving vehicle, how many warning signs are missed before the system finally intervenes? And how many victims never live long enough for justice to arrive? Lonnie Franklin Jr., State, California, age 64, died on death row. For nearly 2 decades, a killer moved through South Los Angeles so quietly that his crimes blended into the background noise of poverty, addiction, and neglect. Police would later call him the Grim Sleeper, a name that captured the most unsettling feature of the case: long stretches of silence between bursts of murder. At the center was Lonnie Franklin Jr., a man who appeared ordinary, invisible even, while a trail of bodies accumulated just blocks from his home. Franklin was born in 1952 and spent much of his adult life working as a garbage truck driver in Los Angeles. He lived in a modest neighborhood, was married, raised children, and projected the image of stability. That domestic normalcy was the perfect camouflage. Behind it, Franklin led a double life that preyed almost exclusively on black women, many of them sex workers, whose disappearances rarely generated urgency or headlines. The murders began in the mid-1980s and continued sporadically through 2007. Victims were found dumped in alleys, trash bins, or behind abandoned buildings in South Los Angeles. Some were shot with the .25 caliber handgun, a weapon that would later become a critical forensic link. Others were strangled. What shocked investigators years later was not only the brutality, but the pattern of dormancy. After killing multiple women between 1985 and 1988, Franklin appeared to stop. Then, years later, he resumed, as if flipping a switch. That pause allowed him to evade detection while law enforcement struggled to connect cases spread over decades. The illusion finally cracked in 2010, not through traditional detective work, but through advances in DNA technology. Investigators collected DNA from Franklin's son after a discarded item provided a familial match. That lead pointed directly back to the quiet house investigators had overlooked for years. When police searched Franklin's garage, they uncovered photographs of women, some identified as victims, others believed to be potential targets. The images transformed the narrative. This was not random violence. It was a private archive of domination and memory. Franklin's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Survivors came forward, including women who had been shot and left for dead, their testimonies bridging gaps that evidence alone could not fill. At trial, which lasted 6 months, prosecutors laid out a methodical portrait of a serial killer who exploited social invisibility. The defense attempted to challenge forensic links and timelines, but the weight of DNA, ballistics, and survivor accounts proved overwhelming. In 2016, Franklin was convicted of 10 counts of murder and sentenced to death. The verdict was seen by many as a long overdue acknowledgement of victims who had been ignored for years. Yet the story did not end with closure. In 2020, before his execution could be carried out, Franklin died of natural causes in prison, taking with him any remaining answers about the full scope of his crimes. The grim sleeper case leaves behind a disturbing question that continues to echo in true crime history. How many killers are able to hide in plain sight? Not because they are brilliant, but because their victims are considered disposable, and who pays the price for that silence? William Lewis Reece, Estate, Oklahoma, age 62, death row. For years, Texas highways carried more than freight. They carried a predator who understood how distance, darkness, and indifference could erase women without a trace. It was William Lewis Reece, a long-haul truck driver whose crimes revealed how easily violence can hide inside routine motion. Born in 1959, Reece worked routes across Texas and Oklahoma, a profession that gave him access to gas stations, convenience stores, and roadside spaces where people passed briefly and rarely looked back. His criminal history did not begin with murder. As early as the 1980s, Reece had been arrested and convicted for sexual assault, warning signs that followed him across state lines. Each release returned him to the road, where anonymity was built into the job and supervision was minimal. The highways became both workplace and hunting ground. In 1997, Reece escalated. Over the course of that year, he abducted and killed at least 4 young women. Several were taken from ordinary places, like convenience store parking lots, moments that should have been forgettable. Inside his truck, Reece raped and strangled them, then transported their bodies to remote fields and wooded areas known today as parts of the Texas killing fields. He buried the victims in shallow graves along rural roads, locations chosen precisely because no one lingered there. The murders stopped as suddenly as they began, leaving families trapped in uncertainty rather than resolution. For nearly 2 decades, Reece lived with those secrets. He was imprisoned for other offenses, but the killings remained officially unsolved. The silence was not broken by conscience, but by science. In 2016, advances in DNA testing linked Reece to evidence recovered from one of the victims. Confronted with the match, he began to talk. From his prison cell, Reece confessed to multiple murders, calmly directing investigators to burial sites that confirmed his statements. The confessions reframed the case from speculation to certainty. Prosecutors in both Oklahoma and Texas moved quickly. In Oklahoma, Reece was charged with murder in a case strengthened by forensic evidence and his own admissions. At trial, the narrative was stark. This was not an impulsive offender, but a repeat sexual predator who used mobility to evade detection. Jurors heard how he selected victims, how he controlled them, and how he disposed of their bodies. In 2021, Reece was sentenced to death in Oklahoma. Appeals followed, but in 2025 the sentence was upheld. Texas pursued a different outcome. In 2022, Reece received a sentence of life without parole for murders committed within the state. The dual sentences reflected both the interstate nature of his crimes and the fragmented way justice often arrives when violence spans jurisdictions. Reece remains incarcerated, a convicted serial killer whose confessions came far too late for the families who spent decades without answers. The Reece case exposes an uncomfortable truth about life along America's highways. When movement itself becomes a shield, how many predators pass unnoticed, and how many victims vanish simply because no one is looking long enough to see the pattern. Oscar Ray Bolin Jr., State, Florida, age 54, execution date January 7, 2016. The story of Oscar Ray Bolin Jr. reads less like a straight line to justice and more like a long, grinding test of how much strain a legal system can endure before resolution. For 3 decades, his case moved in circles through Florida's courts, marked by retrials, reversals, and a shocking personal detail that blurred the line between defendant and defense. Born in 1962, Bolin lived a transient life from a young age, working intermittently as a truck driver and later as a carnival employee, occupations that placed him on the margins and in constant motion. Long before the murders, he had a documented history of sexual violence dating back to his teenage years, warning signs that never fully restrained him. By the mid-1980s, those patterns escalated into lethal violence. Florida's rural roads and isolated fields became the backdrop for crimes that would haunt the state for decades. In 1986, 3 young women vanished under similar circumstances. Each was abducted, brutally beaten, stabbed, and left in remote rural areas. The attacks were frenzied and personal, leaving little doubt about the intent to kill. Yet despite the brutality, the investigation struggled. Evidence was fragmented, timelines overlapped, and the absence of immediate forensic clarity delayed accountability. For years, the murders existed as open wounds without closure. Bolin was arrested in 1990 after his former wife provided statements implicating him. The case moved to trial, and the jury returned a death sentence in 1991. What followed was an extraordinary legal odyssey. Convictions were overturned due to procedural errors and questions surrounding testimony. Bolin was retried 3 separate times. Each time, prosecutors rebuilt their case. Each time, juries returned unanimous death verdicts. By 2013, Florida's courts reaffirmed his sentence, signaling that the cycle of retrials had reached its end. Throughout his incarceration, Bolin maintained his innocence, even as appeals failed one by one. His marriage to Rosalie Bolin, while on death row, fueled controversy, raising ethical questions and adding a surreal layer to an already complex case. To supporters, it symbolized loyalty and belief in wrongful conviction. To critics, it reinforced the perception of manipulation and delay. On January 7, 2016, Oscar Ray Bolin Jr. was executed in Florida's electric chair. In the hours before his death, he requested a final meal reported to include comfort foods such as fried pork chops, French fries, and dessert, a routine choice that contrasted sharply with the violence of his crimes. His last words were defiant and reflective. Bolin proclaimed his innocence, criticized the death penalty, and expressed love and gratitude toward his wife, framing himself as a victim of the system to the very end. Louis Peoples, State, California, age 37, died on death row. In the spring of 1997, Stockton, California was gripped by a sudden surge of violence that felt both random and intimate, as if the killer knew his victims and the city at the same time. Within a matter of months, 4 people were dead, some gunned down, others strangled, all connected by money, proximity and opportunity. At the center of it was Louis Peoples, a tow truck driver whose life unraveled into a brief but lethal spree that ended with a capital sentence. Peoples was born in 1962 and served in the military before returning to civilian life with few visible anchors. By the mid-1990s, he was working as a tow truck driver in Stockton, a job that placed him in constant contact with garages, stranded motorists, cash payments, and moments of trust. Beneath that routine, however, Peoples was spiraling into heavy cocaine addiction. Prosecutors later described his drug use not as a background detail, but as a driver of escalating desperation. As his dependence grew, so did his willingness to cross lines that could not be uncrossed. The murders began quickly and without a cooling-off period. In 1997, Peoples killed 4 individuals over several months, targeting people he believed had money or access to it. Among the victims were a garage owner and customers who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some were shot at close range. Others were strangled. The crimes were not marked by elaborate planning or ideological motive. They were transactional, violent acts fueled by addiction and opportunism. Each killing meant to solve an immediate need. What shocked investigators was not just the number of victims, but how close Peoples was to them. These were not distant strangers found along highways. They were co-workers, clients, and everyday people connected through ordinary business interactions. The tow truck, meant to represent help and recovery, became part of the backdrop for fear. As bodies accumulated, Stockton residents realized the threat was coming from someone embedded in daily life. Peoples was arrested later in 1997 after investigators tied him to the murders through DNA evidence and witness statements. Once in custody, the case moved swiftly compared to others in this series. Prosecutors in San Joaquin County built a narrative centered on intent and choice. The defense argued that cocaine addiction impaired Peoples' judgment, suggesting diminished responsibility. Jurors rejected that claim. Testimony showed that Peoples made deliberate decisions before, during, and after each killing, including attempts to conceal evidence and flee scenes. In 2000, Louis Peoples was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He was sent to California's death row, where his case faded from public attention, overshadowed by larger serial killer trials and systemic delays in executions. Years passed with little movement. Unlike other condemned inmates, Peoples did not become a symbol or a cause. He remained largely anonymous, defined by the abrupt violence of his crimes rather than prolonged courtroom drama. In 2021, Peoples was found dead in his prison cell, having died by hanging. His death was ruled natural under prison classification, bringing an unanticipated end to a case that had once terrified a city. No execution date, no final statement in a courtroom, just silence. William Bonin, State, California, age 35, execution date February 23, 1996. The crimes of William Bonin represent one of the darkest chapters in California's criminal history, a case so brutal that it permanently altered how law enforcement viewed serial predators operating along highways. Known as the Freeway Killer, Bonin murdered at least 21 boys and young men in a concentrated burst of violence that exposed how mobility, complicity, and unchecked sadism can converge into something catastrophic. Born in 1947, Bonin's path toward violence began long before his killing spree. He worked as a truck driver in California, a job that normalized long hours on the road and frequent stops along freeways. Behind that routine was a history of severe sexual abuse, both suffered and inflicted, dating back to his time in the military and multiple stints in prison. Despite repeated incarcerations for sexual offenses, Bonin was released again and again, each time more dangerous than before. By the late 1970s, the conditions were set for escalation. Between 1979 and 1980, Bonin abducted young males along Southern California freeways, often offering rides or help. Inside his van, later referred to by investigators as the death van, victims were raped, tortured, and mutilated before being strangled. The violence was prolonged and deliberate, sometimes carried out with accomplices who participated or watched. Afterward, bodies were dumped along roadsides in Los Angeles and Orange County, left to be discovered by chance. The pace of the murders was relentless, sometimes only days apart, overwhelming investigators struggling to connect cases across jurisdictions. Bonin's arrest came in 1980, after one of his accomplices provided information to authorities, breaking the secrecy that had protected him. Once in custody, Bonin confessed to 21 murders, a number that stunned even seasoned detectives. He was tried in multiple counties, convicted of 14 counts of first-degree murder, and sentenced to death in 1982. The remaining confessed killings were never fully prosecuted, but the scale of his crimes was never in doubt. For 14 years, Bonin sat on death row as appeals failed. On February 23, 1996, he was executed by lethal injection at San Quentin. His last meal was reported to be simple and unremarkable, including items such as steak, fries, and dessert, a mundane choice that contrasted sharply with the cruelty of his crimes. His last words were brief. Bonin expressed remorse and asked forgiveness from the families of his victims, statements many found hollow given the scope of suffering he caused. The Bonin case forces an enduring question on anyone who studies true crime. When warning signs are repeated, documented, and ignored, who bears responsibility for the victims who come next? And how many lives might be saved if intervention arrives before the van door closes? These cases leave behind more than verdicts and sentences. They leave unanswered questions about warning signs, ignored patterns, and victims who were never protected in time. When violence travels on familiar roads and wears familiar faces, certainty becomes fragile. After everything you've heard, ask yourself if these crimes could happen so quietly, so repeatedly, and for so long. Do you believe justice truly arrived, or only arrived too late?